Hello there. I have so many resources around me, it's quite funny really. Welcome everybody, it's Rosanna here and welcome to this very special video that I've been looking forward to making, which is about how infertility is affected by our family trees and what we can actually do to conceive with ease and actually set the trauma free, the ancestors free. So whatever we have inherited, being able to release it through our own physical experience and therefore also increase our chances of conceiving with ease. So I'm going to try and deal with each aspect. I'm not going to try actually, because the word try implies I can't, and I can, and I would like to implore everybody who is in a process of wanting to conceive with ease to stop trying to get pregnant. Hello, welcome everyone who's joining. The main thing here is that I will talk about it in different ways, but I have worked with so many clients over the years that realise once they've worked with me that they have actually been trying without trying for years, often months, years. And so being able to understand some of the more complex factors that can actually affect our fertility, and then when we know that those factors, how we can then overcome them and clear the blocks to conceiving with ease, that's what this is all about. We're post Remembrance Sunday, we're post the 100th year anniversary of the end of World War I. It's a very important time now, perhaps more than ever, to be able to start looking at the trauma that has been inherited by wars and how that affects us directly and indirectly. And I'm going to be on a little while, so if you can't stay for the whole live stream, then do check out the replay, because this will be very valuable information, and it is my intention in sharing this information to give you an overview of the fact that for me, I really do believe peace reigning on this planet is entirely possible and is happening, is probable. It's what we're moving towards as a human race. Otherwise, we're moving towards our annihilation and extinction. So the premise that I'm coming from is that through clearing our trauma, not only do we increase our fertility, but we also increase our peace quota and our desire to find solutions rather than to recreate trouble and to recreate dysfunction as a way of trying to understand it. This will make more sense as I actually get through this. So how does your infertility, or how is your infertility affected by your family tree? Well, I think one of the first things for us to actually look at here is what are the main factors that affect fertility. And I have got my computer out, I have got handouts out, I've got whiteboards out, you name it, I've got it, because this is an area of fascination. So I did a quick search on Google, and the main things that come up as factors that actually affect our fertility are age, and it is commonly thought that it's just the older we get, the harder it is to get pregnant, and I do believe this is true, but it's not for the reasons that we are expressed to us, but mainly because of degeneration due to poor lifestyle choices, and also to the not clearing of difficult and challenging emotions and beliefs and memories that are within us that we just compact further down, and through time we find all sorts of coping mechanisms, whether they are addictions, whether they are, well, they could be any kind of addiction, from drinking, smoking, shopping, to listening to the radio and not allowing yourself to think, you know, any way of coping with not actually dealing with what's inside of you is going to be something that is impacted by age, because we get long in the tooth, don't we? The older we get, we either get more set in our ways, or we seek to overcome getting set in our ways and continue with the neuroplasticity that is available to us in earlier life. Hereditary factors are another contributing factor to infertility, and again I would suggest when you look at genetics and epigenetics, and I'll be talking a little bit about epigenetics as I look at some of the studies that I wanted to mention, we recognise that hereditary factors are both a combination of nature and nurture. So there will be a genetic predisposition to something, but the way that we are nurtured, the way that we come to see ourselves, to see life, to deal with the things inside of us will, and by things I mean how we perceive ourselves, so how we deal with our well-being, how we feel about our sexuality, how we feel about our menstrual flow, how we feel about men, how we feel about women, how we feel about prosperity. All of these things are how we relate to the outer world, our environment, and the way that we relate to our outer world will largely stem from the way our parents related to the world that we were born into, because we learn through observation, through mimicking. And any parent will know that it's not what they say that their children listen to, but it's what they do that they end up emulating. So this is very important for us to recognise as parents to be. We know that smoking and alcohol are big factors in contributing to infertility. But then the question I would ask you, I mean, we know don't smoke, don't drink, but the point is, why do we smoke? Why do we drink? Why do we need to do these things habitually? To suppress something. What are we seeking to suppress? Well, the lungs are associated with grief. The liver, when you think about alcohol, is associated more with repressed anger and rage. So just these emotional components, if this is new to you, just be open to the idea that both the medical profession and psychology are kind of coming together now and understanding how the way we feel affects our physiology, and our perception of the environment that we're in also affects our physiology. And I want to invite you on a journey with me. So whether you have explored the ideas that I am sharing with you now before or not, keep an open mind. I'm not a historian, I'm not a nutritionist. What I am is a birth specialist. I specialise in fertility. I work with fertility and have done for the last 15 years. I've worked with pregnancy and birth for the last 18 years. I'm a senior yoga teacher. I'm a fertility specialist, as I said, a pregnancy specialist, a birth and postnatal trauma specialist, and I'm also an emotional mental detox coach, Reiki master. I have worked with the medical profession in capacity as the chair of the Croydon University Hospital Maternity Services Liaison Committee in previous years. I'm the founder of Enjoy Yoga, which specialises in pregnancy, postnatal and baby yoga, and also the founder of Rosy Glow, where I work with clients who want to work with deep trauma release in a graceful and easy way. So this is some of my background. I've worked with over 5,000 women, their partners and their children in the last 20 years. And it's really very interesting when you actually start to look at longitudinal studies and you know people before they get pregnant, and then you see how their pregnancy goes, and then you see how their birth goes, and then how they bond with their babies and what their experience of parenthood is afterwards, and how much they have dealt with the stuff that they carry around with them, so the baggage they have inherited before they actually conceive, and how easily they conceive, and then what the journey of the pregnancy is, whether it's a stressful journey or an enjoyable journey. All of these things have an impact, and it has been, I feel I've been incredibly privileged to be able to observe all of this over time and to be able to share with you what I have learned. And this is one perspective, it's open to lots of interpretations. I hope what it will do is ignite people's passion to explore further those things that sort of wake you up, make you feel, oh, hold on a minute, that's resonating with me. And the more when I work with my fertility clients, I have a really, really high success rate with working with people, whether it's 3 months or a year. We're somewhere between 80 and 85% success rate at the moment in terms of the people I work with conceiving and then going on to have babies, healthy babies. And that's very different kind of statistics to clinics. And the reason for that is the depth of the work that I go into and the way that I create a safe environment for things that are difficult to be explored, and for the connections to be made so that people can see how these aspects have been influencing them without them realising. And again, I'll explain more as we go into it, so bear with me. I think I need to take a deep breath. Okay, so another factor that's huge is toxins. So we know the toxins in plastics, for example, and also endocrine disruptive chemicals are a big factor in infertility. And even if you lead a pretty clean life and you don't eat microwave meals and you don't use cosmetic products that are from your high street stores, and you don't wear perfume, and you don't have those air fresheners that you plug in, and you kind of take care, depending on the quality of your water, you are actually taking a lot of toxins in through your tap tap water, and it's not enough to have a normal water filter. It's important to be looking at the more expensive and complex water filters for being able to purify your water, so that you haven't got all of this residual toxins that come from hormones, from any kind of pharmaceutical drug, and also from hormonal contraception, and of course plastics and everything else, all of the chemicals that are in our water supply. So that's something important. Obesity is another factor that contributes, and you're going to see how this relates to the war stuff in a second. Low body weight, excessive exercise. Again, think about, why do we exercise excessively? Why do we smoke? Why do we drink? This is a no judgment space here. I am not saying to anybody anything like, you must stop this, you must stop that. I'm asking you to be able to look deeper into why you may want to do these things. And I come from a highly addictive background myself, and from a very fearful background. So understanding how we choose to do things to pacify, to numb out, is something that I'm a bit of an expert in. So hormonal contraception, we mentioned as well, is a big issue. Thyroid disease is a big issue. Caffeine, and then medical conditions, so gynecological and autoimmune medical issues. Now, we hear, oh, I can't get pregnant because I've got endometriosis. Oh, I can't get pregnant because I've got fibroids. Oh, I can't get pregnant because I've got polycystic ovaries. My interest is in why have you got these conditions? How have they come about? Because it's not just that you've randomly got them. That's where I'm coming from, is that there is a reason that you have some kind of I don't like the word defect, but something isn't working right in the area that is your ultimate space for creation, your femininity. The same for men and their sperm and their testicles, and all of the things that go on with our reproductive health is going to also relate to how we feel about ourselves as women, how we feel about ourselves as men, and what our relationship is to our sexuality and our creativity, because the energy that makes babies, so our fertile energy, is one and the same as our sexual energy and our creative energy. And whether you call it kundalini, whether you call it prana, whether you call it juiciness, it's our desire for life, it's our joy for life, it's our ability to be beyond our conditioning, that we feel free in ourselves, that we feel beyond judgment of what is good and what is bad, that we are allowing ourselves to exist beyond guilt, blame and shame, which anyone who's a mother will tell you these are prevalent emotions as mothers, that, as is worry. You know, it is one of those things that we feel we are expected out of love to worry for our children, to worry for life. And worrying is one of the most unhelpful things we can do for creating what we want to create in our lives, whether that is seeing our children prosper, whether it is being able to conceive ourselves naturally, whether it is caring about a loved one. Worry is a stress response, and it actually weakens the immune system of ourselves and those we love. So there is this energetic connection that I'm going to keep coming back to. And some of what I'm talking about is very much steeped in science and is, you know, latest scientific research and discoveries, but some of it is more about the esoteric and is more about the energetic. And these days, yoga, you know, this is my field, is getting a lot of scientific backing for how it works. Whereas for years and years and years, the yogis would say yoga's a science, and this would kind of be laughed at. Thank you for the hearts. But actually, you know, it is, you know, when you actually look at how you can regulate the systems of your body, how you can affect your nervous system, how you can affect your homeostasis, how you can affect your endocrine system, how you can shift blood flow around your body through intention, how you can learn to observe the thoughts in your mind, in your brain rather, without judgment. Well, no, it is the mind, and to start to shift your focus towards thoughts that heal rather than thoughts that harm. This is all information that helps you to see where you can be more in control with your conscious mind, and where you need to work more with the subconscious to be able to clear the negative inheritance you may have picked up from those who brought you into this world. And this is in no judgment towards them, by the way, because obviously we are all the product of our conditioning, we're all the product of our early influences. And I'm fascinated by our government's 1001 Day manifesto, because this recognises that the year prior to birth, so the 3 months prior prior to conception, the 9 months in utero, and then the birth, the immediate postnatal period, and the 2 years after are fundamental in how we are shaped to then exist in the world around us. So how we deal with new experiences, how safe we feel to ask for what we need, how we socialize, how we develop, how our motor skills develop, and how we develop mentally and physically. All of this plays a huge part in these early influences. So we do know, for example, that animals that have an early attack in their lives when they're puppies or they're kittens tend to be scarred for life, and they have a different consciousness to us. I mean, we have the ability to look back and to use our brains in a different way, but the idea here is that if we don't bring consciousness to how our early influences shape us, we then become living examples of those early influences, and we are just a conditioned response rather than ever moving beyond that. And that's what I'm seeing has happened in the last few generations, in terms of the fact that we might be, in your family, you might be 5th generation post World War One now, or you might be 3rd generation post World War One now, depending on how old grandparents and parents were before they had us, and then if we have gone on to have children. So I just want to really highlight, before I go on too many tangents, that the gynecological issues and the autoimmune issues are related to how safe we feel in the world, and how safe we feel in the world will relate to how safe our mother felt and how safe our maternal grandmother felt when they were carrying us in utero. So if you're wondering how your grandmother can possibly be affecting you, it's worth remembering that little girls, when they're in utero, are supposedly born with all the eggs they're ever going to produce in their ovaries, so before they're born. So this means that, I think it's by about 4 months gestation, we have them all the eggs are formed in the embryo, in the ovaries. So that means we have a direct experience of our grandmother's physical experience, what she ate, what her stress levels were like, how happy she was, how she perceived the world, will be influencing those eggs that were in our mother's ovaries as our mother was growing inside our grandmother. So that's pretty fascinating stuff, you know, just on its own. Now, there is some more recent research around the fact that stem cells in the ovaries can produce more eggs, or more egg stem cells can produce more eggs. But whatever the truth is, that will still be based on the original blueprint, which will be based on that direct experience. So this is important. And also inflammation is a big part of autoimmune issues, and inflammation is related to our dietary and lifestyle choices. And if you think about the rationing in the wars, the First and the Second World War, then the fact that we went sugar happy in the baby boom period, and that sugar became so popular and so accessible and so cheap, and we have ended up with all sorts of issues, including diabetes, gestational diabetes, and there is some research, I think, linking Alzheimer's or dementia as a type 3 diabetes. So again, sugar being a part of this, and stress. So these are just things to look at. Sometimes my research, sometimes I get a bit confused. So I have looked at a lot of studies, and I do invite you to research what I'm saying so you can find out more, or you can get in touch if there's something specific you'd like to know about. But this isn't just coming from my head. So you know, there is a lot of research that goes behind this, and this has been an area of passion for me for many years. Okay, so sexual health is also an issue, and we have much happier, well, we have screenings with sexual health these days, but if we had syphilis in our great-grandparents and our grandparents and great-great-grandparents, syphilis was rife, as were other conditions that could have affected our mental health and our reproductive health as time has gone on. Even if it's post that generation, it's the what we carry in our cellular memory and our DNA. And stress is a huge factor in contributing to fertility issues. So this is kind of where I want to start from in terms of exploring the effects of how our family tree and their experiences really have affected our ability or inability to conceive, and also the health conditions we have and how we feel in the world today. So I'll put this down for now. And what I'd invite you to consider is, when we are in the womb and we are first experiencing things. Tagging people. I don't know. Do I want to tag people? Let me try that. I'll tag you. Yeah, baby. Let's do that. Hello, people. Okay, so yes, when we actually think about being in the womb, when you're in the womb and your brain is developing, we have here, I wrote some notes that in week 3 gestation, okay, so this is before we have a heartbeat. This is before we know we have missed a period. So it's when we think that we are pregnant, but we're not sure yet, okay? And maybe we are, maybe we're not. Remember that the way that they actually count pregnancy is from your last missed period, but we don't get pregnant in our last missed period. We usually get pregnant 2 weeks after. So 2 weeks after that, you'd be expecting a period. And if you didn't actually get a period, you might be then thinking you are pregnant. So that would technically be week 3, but it would be counted as week 5 potentially, depending on how they go with the gestational age. So say a week after your missed period, for clarity's sake. We have here the beginnings of the brain, the spinal cord, the heart, the circulatory system, the digestive system, and between weeks 4 to 6, we have basically developed the foundations of our nervous system, our cardiovascular system, and our digestive system. So this is so early on in pregnancy that very often we have chemical miscarriages. So we've literally just been pregnant for a very, very short period of time, and then we get our period. So we're a few days late. And this is when all of this is trying to form, but it's not happening. And again, a huge factor contributing to that will be stress, and will be all of the other factors that I mentioned now, 14, that are putting stress on your body. But if you think of this in terms of what comes first, does a belief come first? Does an emotion come first? Does a thought come first? Well, when you're developing in utero, your brain isn't functioning in the same way that it does when you are an adult thinking or a child thinking, depending on the age. You're just absorbing experience. So whose experience are you absorbing? Well, who else but your mother's and the people around her that she is interacting with, whether those are close people, like hopefully the father, potentially other siblings you may have, parents, cousins, family members, friends, but also work colleagues, and what is the environment that you're in? Well, again, hopefully these days for most of us, it's a pretty safe environment. We're warm, we've got shelter, we've got food, we've got love. But back in the World War days, what was going on? Well, we had raids, we had loss, we had partners going to war. We never knew if we were going to see them again. We had the fact that women started to work. Now, before World War I, women had started entering the workforce, so they were already involved in textiles primarily. But with the First World War and men going off to war, lots more women were working. So they were suddenly getting independence. And I want to put things in some chronology for you before I go back to that feeling thing I was talking about. So World War I was July 1914 to November 1918. Okay, there was a type of blitz in January 1915, which was before aeroplanes as we know them today were developed. I think it was aircraft that were dropping bombs, not very well targeted. So this was known as the baby killing times, because where the bombs were targeted in England was meaning that when you're actually going for London, you're potentially bombing Hull, and this happened. So the targets were not great, so lots of civilian losses. And we have, Second World War was 1931 to 1945. So just think about this for a second from the point of view of women did not work, except there were lower income women potentially in textiles and in service, so working as maids, working within households. Then you have the fact that men go to war. So suddenly, for a period of time of about 4 years, women are going and doing things they wouldn't normally do. And I think that the first policewoman was also, women on the beat were in the First World War. It might be in the second one, and I've got confused. Women got the right to vote if they were over the age of 30 in 1918, whereas men over the age of 21 were able to vote then. So 1918, okay, so that's the end of the First World War. But women did not get the right to vote from the age of 21 for another 10 years, which was 1928. And that was before the Second World War. So we have a period of time, and I just want you to think about this, being given freedom and then that freedom being taken away, and the effect of that. You know, if a woman's role for God knows how long was to produce children and be a good wife, and then suddenly off goes daddy, and women may have been pregnant, may have children already, or may not have done, in which case if they did have them, they may have had to send those children away so that they can go to work. So you don't just have the separation of the mother and the father, but you also have the separation of the children from the mother. And if the mother could not afford to keep the children, my grandfather is an example of this. He was a Barnardo's boy. His father was in the First World War. He was conceived just before the First World War, from what I remember. So his dad came back and died when my grandfather was 3 years old from mustard gas poisoning in the lungs. And my great-grandmother could not afford to keep my grandfather at home, so he was sent to an orphanage, and he was then sent out to work as a farm boy. You know, all of this stuff happened for real. So imagine the feeling of that as a young child, being sent away from your family because your family cannot actually afford you. That's one factor that's there. You also have, in terms of women and what women went through, the Blitz in 1940, 1941. So this was the Second World War. And we had women then going and saving lives as nurses, and, you know, being helpful and finding that they had, again, a sense of purpose that was beyond the, unfortunately, as mothers, we have the biggest job description. Like, it's an endless job description. I have a nearly 18-year-old daughter now. And we don't get paid, and we don't get promotions, and we don't get praise. And so I just want to put that out there, that it's the toughest job, in my opinion, in the world to be a mother, because you're an unsung hero. But in the time of the war, women got to experience not being unsung heroes, but being heroes that actually felt their worth dependent on the results they were getting and the thanks that they were getting. And then the war ends and they have to go back to being good wives and good mothers. And I just want to plant that seed for you. If you have a sense in your life that your mum didn't really care about you, or she wasn't really that interested, or work was always more important. Now, I say this as the daughter of a mother that I felt wasn't very present for me. In the sense that it never seemed like she was particularly interested in what I was doing and my passions and my joys. She always seemed like she was a little bit vacant, okay? Now, my mother was not medicated. My mum had no direct trauma herself. But I want to state that my grandmother was in utero. So my great-grandmother was pregnant with my grandmother when she had to escape where she lived, which was the southern part of Turkey, where there was a Greek colony, and basically escape for her life with a toddler in hand. So this was between the First and the Second World Wars, if I remember correctly, when the Turks had taken back over, it was a Turkish country, they'd taken back over this colony that was a Greek colony, and my great-grandfather was apparently dragged out of the bank where he was a manager, and he was beheaded by the Turks. So upon receiving this information, my great-grandmother fled for her life while she was pregnant with my grandmother, and she had a toddler in tow. Now, they relocated in Nezmini, which is one of the suburbs in Athens, but my great-uncle, who was the toddler, smoked himself to death. He ended up dead, I think, in his 40s. And my grandmother, who was born some time later, had a very sweet tooth and ended up with type 2 diabetes, probably had gestational diabetes. Now we look at it because her first child was a stillborn at what is, and it chokes me up to actually think about it now, Croydon University Hospital, so Mayday Hospital. Now, I knew none of this until I moved to South Croydon and told my granddad, because he was still alive, oh, I've moved to South Croydon. He said to me, South Croydon? That's where I'm from. I'm a Barnardo's boy. And I was like, what? And I knew my mum was called Mary. She's one of twins, and I'll explain a little bit more here, because she was born at St Mary's Hospital. So what I then understood, and my granddad told me when I said I was training in pregnancy yoga and I was now working with Croydon University Hospital that was called Mayday, oh, that's where William was born. Now, this was his first son, who was born to my grandmother and my granddad, and almost killed my grandmother because she's a teeny little woman and he was a 10-pound stillborn baby. Now, these days we would potentially associate that with gestational diabetes, high birth weight, not surviving the birth, and the fact that it may well have been my grandmother's super happy sugar addiction because life wasn't sweet enough. So she was going, thank you for the hearts, everybody. So she was basically, yeah, that's where it was. So she didn't have, William died. This is in my cellular memory. And then my mum was one of twins, born at St Mary's, or whatever it was called, again in the Croydon area, which has since closed down. Now, my grandmother died at 63 of a heart attack. She had type 2 diabetes. My great-grandmother died at 84. She was the one that gave birth, she was the one whose husband was beheaded. And my mum died at the age of 60 from a combination of colon cancer, which had spread to the liver. And that the secondary was in the liver. Now, this all relates again to epigenetics and how we process trauma and then how we deal with pain, because usually we want to block pain. And I've got some really interesting studies that relate both to the Holocaust and also studies done with rats and what else? The Dutch famine. The Dutch famine has a lot to say for both mental health issues and issues with food, issues with stress, and diabetes. Okay, so obesity, eating disorders, diabetes, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, all of these relate, and coronary disease as well, relate to the Dutch famine, where we have some absolutely amazing records, because the Dutch were really good. Their medical records stayed intact, and the famine was actually a short period of time, so it was all documented. And depending on the time of gestation, the time of the famine, so which stage of pregnancy the woman was in at the time of the famine, it actually had a different effect on the children. And I'll read a little bit on that. I hope this is interesting enough, and I know it's going on a little bit, but one of the things whenever I'm running teacher training programs for Birthlight, I get all of my students inspired by the idea of our ancestral lineage and our memory, our cellular memory. You know, what took me to Croydon, what took me to work for 12 years with a hospital that had one of the worst maternity units in the country when I got there, and I worked with them, and it wasn't just me, there were others who were all working with the Maternity Services Liaison Committee, but Enjoy Yoga was intrinsic because we were sending one after another message from the women who had birthed there with their experiences, their stories, and that way we worked with the head of midwifery and the deputy head to be able to find which midwives, which obstetricians, bedside manner, and the way that they were dealing with women behind closed doors was actually robbing them of an empowering experience, whether it was medicalised or not. So they managed to wipe out all of the medical staff that weren't willing to adjust their bedside manner and the way that they were working with women, and pulled in a whole load of new amazing midwives and obstetricians. And like the last births I've attended at that hospital, I'm just so happy with what I've seen in terms of the changes that have taken place. And in the time that I was working with that particular Maternity Services Liaison Committee, we went from being one of the worst hospitals, maternity units, to one of the best in the country. So, you know, what took me to do that? And I was stuck in Croydon. I wanted to move to Brighton for years and years and years and years and years. And then 12 years in Croydon, something was achieved. Suddenly I was kicked out and I got to move down here. Now, more to this is, I'm not going to go, it's not all about my story, right? But I just want to highlight we all have a story. When you start asking questions, it's fascinating. So I have a daughter that was born when I was 22. I desperately wanted to have a baby from the age of 8. Now, she has only just been diagnosed with female ADHD, and bless my little girl, because she has said her whole life, there's something wrong with me, Mummy, there's something wrong with me. And I was adamant there was nothing wrong with her. She was just a sensitive child, an emotional empath like me. And, you know, she felt that something was off. And she's finally had this diagnosis after 6 years of being in the child and adolescent mental health services. Now, whatever my beliefs are and how I feel about medication and how I feel about the way mental health is diagnosed, my daughter also experienced what I experienced. She experienced a mother that effectively wasn't present. And again, I say this with a very soft heart and forgiveness towards myself, but as a very young mum, you know, I spent all of my pregnancy terrified. I was in a new relationship. I was very anxious. I had a lot of guilt, a lot of fears, a lot of anxiety. I gave birth to a child that had high needs from the start, definitely not one of those easy babies. And I was a single mother by the time she was 10 months old. So I had, and that was by choice because I was dealing with mental health issues with her father and I actually couldn't cope with it. So in the end, it was me focusing on myself and my child, but the stresses of being a single mother and then running your own business and then losing my own mother when I was 30, so my daughter was 8, like lots of factors that led to my daughter going through a terrible time in her teenhood, absolutely terrible, depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicidal stuff, you name it, we've been there. And, you know, this is despite me knowing everything that I know up here. What I'm trying to explain to you is you can understand things cognitively. And this is it, when we talk about trauma from previous generations, we can understand it, but that doesn't mean that we're clearing it. It doesn't mean that we're releasing it. And until I was doing work with my teacher, Susanna Kennedy, thank you, Hope. I think these are really important things for us to talk about because we've all been there one way or another, you know, whether we've had miscarriages, terminations, whether we've been raped, whether we've been abused physically, sexually, emotionally, whether we've seen that our unprocessed pain has affected those we love. It's so important we move into no guilt, no blame, no shame and move out of judgment. So really for me, my life started to properly change. And this is what I mean about the trying without trying. I'd been a yoga teacher for years. I'd been a Reiki master for years. I was into self-development for years. But until I was really willing to look at the subconscious programming I'd inherited and the erroneous beliefs that kept me stuck in a loop I just wanted to come out of, nothing really was changing fast. I was on the A road rather than the super fast highway. And through the work I've been doing the last 5 years, I have really seen results. So this is, you know, this is where it's taken me. But let's come back to what we're doing, which is looking at these early influences. So generally speaking, you know, why would you be fearful? Why would you be anxious in pregnancy? Well, there are lots of reasons, but typically if our experience in utero, and this goes back to what I was saying about beliefs, emotions and thoughts. When we're first in the womb, we are just absorbing. We're absorbing hormonal responses from our mother. You know, the placenta acts as an exchange, but essentially if mum is stressed, there'll be more stress hormones coming through. The placenta acts like a buffer, but it can't hold everything. So we get more stress hormones pumping through our bodies, developing bodies and brains. If mum's in a state of rest, repair, feed and breed, so she feels well supported, then what happens there is you have a situation where a baby can really thrive. So we have lots of research around the fact that babies born to high stress conditions, so if a mother's in chronic stress, so in a war-torn area, or maybe the baby's the result of rape or abusive relationship, or the mum's particularly young or not well educated, frightened. Super educated women as well can really be affected by this, but basically stress levels are super high and constant. So think about high stress jobs, for example, where you don't even think about it. You might work in the emergency services, you might be a banker, you might be you know, on the trading floor. There's any number of high stress jobs, but the point is intermittent stress is a good thing for us to adjust to. We learn to adjust to life, but chronic stress is not. And what we see with chronic stress is that the hindbrain will develop more than the neocortex. So the capacity to react first, think later is there in high stress pregnancies, as is low birth weight, as is the risk of going into labour more early, complications in labour as well as complications in pregnancy. Now, why would that be? Come back to this idea of those first weeks when the early systems are formed. If the nervous system, the digestive system and the cardiovascular system are all formed in the first 6 weeks of life, more or less, and then developed, that means that, you know, the time that you're hiding a pregnancy, that you're dealing with the fact that you're pregnant and not telling anybody until you get to that magical 12 weeks, you're in fear of something going wrong because you want this pregnancy, or maybe you don't want it and you're wondering whether you should terminate or not. Do you want this baby, don't you? The guilt that comes with that. And trust me, even women who have wanted babies for years and have been trying for years, when they actually find they're pregnant, a whole cocktail of emotions come up, and sometimes they're unexpected. You know, a lot of fears can come up, but usually, and this is where in the previous video I gave the example of Michelle Obama. She has talked publicly about the fact that she needed to use IVF to conceive her daughter after she had a miscarriage. And I want to give you this example. So if you've had a previous termination, for example, and then you've fallen pregnant or found you pregnant, if you feel guilty and you have unprocessed guilt around that termination, then you may feel on some level that you deserve to be punished for being pregnant now, that you're undeserving of being pregnant because of the fact that you were pregnant before and you chose not to have a baby. That's just in the subconscious. It's just there, just saying. So that's there within the physiology of your being, and you're processing that information. So in terms of being able to carry a baby to term, the higher the stress levels in early pregnancy, the more likely we are to miscarry, because of the fact that the stress can really contribute to the cell division not being optimal. Now, I'm not saying it is the causal factor, but we know that reducing stress is very important for supporting pregnancy outcomes. Okay, so nearly half of pregnancies, early pregnancies, end in miscarriage, which is interesting, isn't it? Because that cell division again is a huge part of it. Nature knows what it's doing. We say this, but then we have babies that are born that have developmental issues, either physical developmental issues or mental developmental issues. We have babies that need operations, and so the question is then how we got through the early pregnancy, and then chronic stress or other factors may have contributed to the pregnancy, the child not developing in such a way where everything was healthy. Now, this is where we go back to those 3 months prior to the conception, and the fact that egg maturation and sperm maturation, it's about 2.5 months for sperm maturation to occur. So the sperm that's released today was programmed according to conditions from 2.5 months ago, and egg-wise 3 to 4 months ago. The conditions of whatever your experience was 3 to 4 months ago will be determining the hardiness and the predisposition genetically of the egg that is released this month. Okay, and one of the things that is not talked about enough, and this is why I hope that this video will make it to fathers-to-be to watch as well, is that the health of the father is massively important. You know, although the mother is the incubator for a baby, the DNA is 50-50. So a mother might be doing all the clean living stuff she possibly can, but if dad's still spraying aftershave and using his toxic shaving cream and using toxic deodorants and putting his phone in his pocket and eating microwave meals, drinking too much beer, not taking supplements that are going to help, all that kind of thing, then it's not likely that it's going to be easy for, again, this pregnancy to get beyond the development of the placenta, because the placenta is primarily the male DNA, the sperm DNA, the DNA from the sperm that will create the organ that is the placenta. And so the placenta is like an alien. It's an invasion in the mother. And if I take this back to the war talk, you know, do we feel safe to have foreign DNA embed itself into the lining of our womb to then create a hybrid, which is the child that we are going to birth? And, you know, these are just things that I think really we don't think about enough, but actually play a big part. So, in the womb, you are experiencing sensations of your mother. Your mother is perceiving the environment around her. Does she really love the father? Is she in love with him? Is the child even the father's child? I mean, back in the war days, think about it. What was happening then? Bombs dropping, men going off, children going off, women getting to work and having their independence. So they're having to do roles they didn't do before. You then have second families. How many stories are there of second families where men were actually having other families in other countries, and whether this was talked about when they came home or not. What about the women that were left behind? What about the we might die tomorrow, live for today, and therefore the promiscuity? 1920s was a very interesting time in terms of the fact that so much was still illegal in terms of how we lived our lives, but there was a real interest in exploring beyond convention. And, all of this is post-Victorian suppression coming out. But I just think it's just so interesting to think about the fact that women would have been living for today as much as the men were, and possibly falling in love with other men, possibly conceiving other men's children, carrying them off as their partner's children. I mean, well, how much got swept under the carpet? Really, what are the stories in your family? I've talked about my one, but we do know that if a mum's been highly stressed in pregnancy, or if a key event has happened that was very traumatic, that can really have an effect on the child that's in utero and make them a jumpy baby, make them very difficult to settle, make them very difficult to be able to go to sleep, even to have digestive issues. And this again relates to what I was saying about those early weeks and the development in the early weeks. So let me just see if I'm kind of on track. So we've talked about how our infertility is affected by a family tree, and what we can do to conceive with ease and to set our ancestors free. So back to Michelle Obama, this issue here where we've had a miscarriage or a termination. I was talking about terminations before. So the guilt that can come, and then this idea that we feel deserving of punishment, which is all conditioning, because we made a choice earlier in our lives that was the right choice, because it wouldn't have been right to bring a child into this world at that time. But there is so much conditioning, religious conditioning, societal conditioning about whether it's right or it's wrong. To go through a process like that, I can only imagine is just the toughest decision ever. I know that my mother went through it. I haven't been through it. But we also had a lot of backstreet abortions going on in our ancestors, which may have left damage. And I know my aunt, for example, was left infertile because she bleached herself internally as a way of preventing herself being pregnant. Like so many stories, the things that we can hear about if your family will talk to you. But in terms of miscarriage, which is something that I think is so common for women, either through the IVF journey or in terms of being able to get pregnant initially and then not being able to conceive again. That trauma, that loss of a baby, especially if you didn't expect it, so an embryo or a fetus, because it would have been early. Sometimes it can be in mid-pregnancy too. Sometimes there is a need for a late termination, which is heartbreaking. That's enough for anybody to feel, don't want to do that again. Yes, I want a baby, but OMG, I don't want to do that again. And the connection is making love. The union of two people created a pregnancy. That pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. So I don't want that again. So then you kind of disassociate and you say, right, well, this is too emotional. So I want a clinical approach. This is subconscious. If I don't do it this way and I do it this way, maybe it will stick. And this is where we get the success rates with IVF for women that just can't conceive again after either they have had a miscarriage or maybe they have had a previous child and they're seeking to get pregnant again, but there is trauma that has come up that has not been dealt with and isn't being looked at and is just being run away from. And again, please don't take that as a judgment. The ways that we run from things that feel too painful for us to experience. And if I go back to my story about my great-grandfather being beheaded, I talk to any of my family members that are in my maternal bloodline. They cannot talk about it without making a joke of it and laughing it off. So this is my mother's generation. They cannot talk about it without laughing it off. My dad, who's not related, is able to impart sort of more historical information towards me, but the others they just can't deal with it. They just can't deal with it. She was a mad woman. He ran away from her. It was his chance to escape. He didn't really get beheaded. Like just all sorts of nonsense that comes out because basically they can't deal with the trauma. I'm obsessed with it because I'm the next generation and I know how much fear I've carried in my body. I was a nervous child, scared of death, scared of the dark, feeling terribly unsafe from as young as I can remember, 3 or 4 years old. And no one could appease me, no one could make me feel safe. And I didn't believe in the concept of God that was being put forward to me. And I felt really lost at sea from as young as I can remember. That was my consciousness about me. Now, if we go, and I know lots of children feel that way in same relation to feeling that their parents didn't really care about them and weren't really interested in them, particularly the mothers. And if you think that your grandmother or your mother may have developed a coping mechanism to deal with her pain through drinking, smoking, being on antidepressants, being on Valium, mummy's little helper back in the day. Again, like, let's not deal with things, let's just be happy, yeah? All of this stuff would have created some kind of block with you. And so our time in the womb shapes us, our birth shapes us even more and either compounds the messages that we had in utero. Our early time post-birth, so first month, first hour, first month, first 3 months, either further compounds or undoes the trauma that we may have picked up, the stress response, the whatever the norm was when we were in utero can be undone. I mean, the neuroplasticity of a baby and a child under the age of 3 is phenomenal. It continues, but it's not as dominant as we get older. So the younger we are, the easier it is to overcome trauma, and certainly first 7 years of life. So if you think about children that were adopted or children that were separated from their mothers at birth or their fathers at birth, maybe they needed to go into an ICU unit. So maybe they were born prem, or maybe there were complications at birth and they were separated. You know, our health services really do their best to provide the best possible care, and it's amazing medical care, but we're only just starting to learn now how to properly support the repair work that's necessary when separation has occurred. And you bet your bottom dollar that your grandmother, when she was born, unless she was born at home, if she was born in a hospital, she would have been separated from her baby or her mother at birth, and your mother would have been as well. We may not have been, but you know, the days of huge nurseries where babies were bottle fed first because that was the norm, and then they were given to their mothers, and mothers were told to breastfeed their babies every 4 hours and to leave their babies out in the garden to cry it out. It was good for their lungs. We were slapped at birth. All these things have happened, okay? These are things that happened to our ancestors as we carry these codes in our body. So being born, scary. Being in utero, potentially scary. Once you're born, scary. Being left alone, abandonment. My needs are not important. I cry and no one comes to me. How safe are you going to feel to grow a baby if this is in your ancestral stuff? And yeah, you may have no idea about it. You put the telly on in the morning, you eat your cereal, you listen to the radio in the car, you have chats with your friends, you read magazines. You've never really thought about this, but suddenly you can't get pregnant and you don't know why you can't get pregnant. And you love going down to the gym, you love your hot yoga, your spinning classes, your running, your horse riding, all of these things that help you sweat it out, whatever stress you have. But, you know, it's not really getting rid of the stress, it's temporarily releasing it. But what it's really doing is keeping your body in a high state of alert. And this is not helping the body to move into rest, repair, feed and breed, which is the parasympathetic nervous response that allows the blood to come back to the digestive and the reproductive organs and to do cellular repair. When we're in a high state of stress, which is, you have the HPA axis, I'm not going to go into it in this video, but let's just say the fight, flight, freeze response. Okay, so fight or flight. Most of us are in it most of the time. Some of us find it exciting. In fact, we court adrenaline because it's what we're used to in the womb. We're used to having lots of adrenaline spikes, so we like watching scary movies, or we like dramas, or we like soap operas, or we like to play video games that are like got you on the edge, or you like roller coasters, or you like extreme sports, or you like pushing your body to the extreme. Do you get what I mean? Like, look at what this is all about. It's an addiction to stress hormones, okay? Why would we be addicted to them? Because they were our early experience. They were our norm. If I take this one step a little away, which is those of us who have never been able to get pregnant, that actually we have tried, or we are trying, and when we've not missed a period, in the sense that we have not been late, for example, or not beyond a chemical pregnancy. Now, again, when I look back at all the clients I've worked with, invariably there may have been some kind of disturbance to the menstrual flow, menstrual cycle earlier in life, potentially eating disorders, and or over exercising. So again, if you think about gymnastics, swimming, that kind of thing earlier in life, these can be big factors. But if you take it a step further, you can then think of the fact that if you feel unsafe, if you feel as though you're not cared for, as though you're not important, as though in your home you have to be the one that holds everything together as a child. You know, you may have been the child of an alcoholic parent, a mother or a father. You may have been a child in a family where there was a lot of shouting. Both parents worked, there wasn't a lot of money, you were expected to do everything. You know, all of this contributes to the idea that as much as you may want to have a baby, you don't feel safe to have a baby. And this is what brings me back to talking to people about how they feel in themselves and whether they feel a baby would want to grow in those feelings. Like in your womb, how do you feel in yourself most of the time? Do you feel happy? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel that you'll be happy when? Or do you generally feel content in your being? Now, when I gave the example of myself being pregnant and being highly stressed, I actually had hyperemesis all through my pregnancy. I was throwing up from morning to night until the day I left the office, which was 36 weeks. Thankfully, my office was down the road, or maybe not so thankfully. I had to reduce my workload to a 3-day week from 30 weeks pregnancy because of the fact that I couldn't keep food down. But I have a history of bulimia. I have a history of, purging to feel safe, like wanting to comfort, eat, and then purging. So my response to stress was get this out, And so again, like we can get pregnant or we can not get pregnant. Stress can prevent us from getting pregnant in the first place, or we can get pregnant and then be very frightened throughout the pregnancy. So what was in my favour, if you like, was my age, because I was 21 when I was pregnant. It would be much harder for a woman later in life who is highly stressed and had the nervous system response I had to get pregnant, because of the fact that there's that many more years where she has been perpetuating that way of being in the world. So her coping mechanisms are more embedded, and she's not as vital and vibrant as she would be on the basis that if her lifestyle choices are not optimal, then this would be the case. So it would become harder and stress will be a bigger contributing factor. Now, I've talked about direct trauma being an issue that could prevent pregnancy. So this could be a direct experience of abuse, rape, abortion, miscarriage, stillborn. Okay, all of these things are direct experiences, abandonment and rejection as well of our parents. So whether we were adopted or whether we were fostered out, whether family members looked after us or other members of our family. These are all direct experiences, and as a result could either prevent you getting pregnant in the first place, or once you have conceived, make it difficult for you to conceive naturally again because of unprocessed stuff that needs looking at. Indirect trauma is what we inherit, and this is where I want to go a little bit into these studies. Bear with me, because I kind of used, I'm not so up with all the names, but Meghan, Prince Harry's wife, who's pregnant, who is 37 and is apparently a geriatric, far too old to be having babies. I just want to relate again this idea of age being more to do with how healthy we are rather than our age being the issue. It's not so much the age. If you are healthy, and by healthy I mean that you are eating a high purine fat lifestyle, high essential fatty acids, low toxins, etc., and you are doing exercise that suits your body, your nervous system response is one where rest, repair, feed and breed, so the oxytocin response, the parasympathetic nervous system, gets triggered every day, not just when you're asleep, that you feel well in yourself, then age is not so important. When stress is high in your life, age is important. And of course, the older we get, the more we're seeking to conceive and feeling we can't, the more stressed we get about it. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle. But the key is to start making changes where you can, and that is the external changes, which are the lifestyle choices, but also the internal changes, which is clearing up the trauma. The trauma is, and here it goes. So the indirect trauma, we talked about the Dutch famine, So just reading you a little synopsis here. Small size at birth is linked with an increased risk of chronic disease in later life. We know that poor maternal nutrition during gestation may contribute to restricted fetal growth, leading to increased disease susceptibility in later life. So it wasn't one generation, maybe the one after that. Animal studies have shown that undernutrition during gestation is associated with reduced lifespan and increased disease susceptibility. The Dutch famine is a unique counterpart for animal models that study the effects of restricted maternal nutrition during different stages of gestation. So this paper describes the findings from a cohort study of 2,414 people, pretty big, born around the time of the Dutch famine. Exposure to the famine during any stage of gestation was associated with glucose intolerance. We found, so think about here diabetes, okay? And if they then didn't have gestational diabetes with their children, did they have type 2 diabetes later? And do their children therefore have a predisposition to gestational diabetes because they cannot process glucose in the same way that their parents did and their grandparents did? We found more coronary heart disease, a more atherogenic lipid profile, disturbed blood coagulation, how many people have blood disorders, increased stress responsiveness and more obesity amongst those exposed to famine in early gestation. So in early gestation, there were all those issues. So the heart, blood coagulation, atherogenic lipid profile, increased stress responsiveness and more obesity. Remember what I said about digestive tract, cardiovascular and nervous system, all in the first few weeks of pregnancy are developed. Women exposed to famine in early gestation also had an increased risk of breast cancer. So I'm not sure whether that was the baby or the mother, to be honest, but people exposed to famine in mid-gestation had more microalbuminuria and obstructive airway disease. So this was more to do with the lungs and asthma. And I have a whole list of health conditions that are most aggravated by stress. Bear with me on this. Heart disease, asthma, obesity, diabetes, headaches, depression and anxiety, gastrointestinal issues, Alzheimer's, accelerated aging, and premature death. Okay, so you come back to what I was saying before, right? And about how these early influences affect us. So these findings show that maternal undernutrition during gestation has important effects on health in later life, but that the effects on health depend on its timing during gestation. Especially early gestation seems to be a vulnerable period. Adequate dietary advice is very important during this time. So prenatal exposure to the Dutch famine has been associated with increased prevalence to be overweight, hypertension and coronary heart disease. Maternal famine exposure around the time of conception has been related to prevalence of major affective disorders, antisocial personality disorders, schizophrenia, decreased intracranial volume and congenital abnormalities of the central nervous system. Congenital abnormalities of the central nervous system. Well, all of this is related to mental health. Remember that your endocrine and your nervous system are related to your brain function as well, because it's how you perceive everything, mental health, right? Much of this research has focused on clinically diagnosed conditions, and little research has attempted to study the relation of less severe symptoms to this exposure. However, the famine affected fertility, weight gain during pregnancy, maternal blood pressure, infant size at birth and central nervous system development. A reduction in fertility was greater amongst manual workers than those amongst those in other occupations. So a decline in mean birth weight was seen among those exposed to maternal undernutrition during the third trimester. So again, who were your ancestors? What did they do for a living? Never mind whether you were Dutch or not. Just remember that whether we're talking about the Dutch famine, whether we're talking about rations, whether we're talking about any country that was affected, and you know, the world wars were global wars. They affected the world, okay? I'm not going to list all the countries because I don't know them, but whether it was embargoes, whether it was actual bombing, whether it was the fact that resources were not available, food was not available, restricted the type of food that was available, whether it was the trauma of loved ones being taken away from you, it affected the planet. Okay, so we're all in some way affected by it, and if it's not one of the world wars, it will be a civil war. Any war is going to be playing out as trauma in our cellular memory. So the last study I wanted to talk about was about the Holocaust survivors and trauma passed through the genes. So Dr. Rachel Yehuda, she did a study of 32 Jewish men and women who had either been interned in a Nazi concentration camp, witnessed or experienced torture, who had had to hide during the Second World War. Now, this is a study done at New York's Mount Sinai Hospital. They analysed the genes of their children who were known to have increased likelihood of stress disorders and compared the results with Jewish families who were living outside of Europe during the war. The gene changes in the children could only be attributed to Holocaust exposure in the parents, said Yehuda. The study is the clearest example in humans of the transmission of trauma to a child via what is called epigenetic inheritance. The idea that environmental influences such as smoking, diet and stress can affect the genes of your children and possibly even grandchildren. The idea is controversial as scientific convention states that genes contained in DNA are the only way to transmit biological information between generations. However, our genes are modified by the environment all of the time through chemical tags that attach themselves to our DNA, switching genes on and off. Recent studies suggest that some of these tags might somehow be passed through generations, meaning our environment could have an impact on our children's health. So again, environment, when I talk about fertility in other videos I've made, I talk about the fact that the mother is like a maternal periscope. If you can just imagine, the mother's a submarine, and within that submarine is this baby growing, and how mum perceives everything she experiences is feeding information to the baby in utero to prepare itself for the environment it's going to be born into. So how much love, how much money, how much stress, how much good food, how much warmth is present will be experienced by the mother, how she feels about the people around her, and then this will be passed on to the baby so that the baby can develop a hardiness towards the environment that's going to be born into. We are wired to survive, but surviving and thriving are two different things, and this is what I'm saying, that post-World Wars we have been surviving without dealing with our trauma, and we are at a point that we are facing annihilation and extinction. And I don't mean to be too big about that, but you know, if we don't prioritize the well-being of this planet, then we are in a position where we are here and we are in looking at being able to overcome this. Okay, so in the being able to overcome this, we are seeking to heal the trauma, and in the seeking to heal the trauma, we are then in a position to thrive rather than survive the environment that we're in, so we can start to develop health again rather than measures to try and prevent the ill health that we have inherited. Okay, so when we go beyond this, we're looking at, I don't want to go too much more into that Holocaust study, but I think there is some interesting studies done with rats that experience fear. So can you inherit a memory of trauma? Research has already shown that certain fears might be inherited through generations, at least in animals. Scientists at Emory University in Atlanta trained male mice to fear the smell of cherry blossom by pairing the smell with a small electric shock. Eventually, the mice shuddered at the smell even when it was delivered on its own. Despite never having encountered the smell of cherry blossom, here we go, sorry about that. So, yes, so where are we? Scientists at Emory University Hospital trained male mice to fear the smell of cherry blossom by pairing the smell with a small electric shock. Eventually, the mice shuddered at the smell even when it was delivered on its own. Despite never having encountered the smell of cherry blossom, the offspring of these mice had the same fearful responses to the smell, shuddering when they came in contact with it. So too did some of their offspring. On the other hand, offspring of mice... Hello, sorry, someone keeps calling me. What was coming to there is that there was no fear of the cherry blossom in those who had not been programmed for it. So the fearful mice produced sperm which had fewer epigenetic tags on the gene responsible for producing receptors that sense cherry blossom. The pups themselves had an increased number of cherry blossom smell receptors in their brain, although how this led to them associating the smell with fear is still a mystery. Okay, bottom line is, we inherit stuff. I hope that me sharing this presentation with you today has at least given you the idea that how you feel in yourself, how well you are, whether you have got a gynecological health condition, whether you've got an autoimmune health condition, whether you really suffer from stress in such a way that it's difficult to sleep, or you suffer from anxiety, depression, remembering that depression is an exhausted nervous system, and anxiety is a response to stress, as are panic attacks. All of this is our physiology playing out our emotional and psychological blueprint, okay, which is something we inherit from our conception, our time in the womb, our birth, our first year of life and our first 7 years of life. And in that time, if our parents are doing the work ahead of us to actually clear the trauma that they have inherited through emotional mental detox, through asking those questions within and being willing to deal with what is there so that we can each create more safety within ourselves, then we're in a position to be able to undo the damage that we have inherited and actually to create a new profile. And one of the things I see with the clients I work with is when they do really do the deeper work with me, that some people really do need to work with me one-to-one, and that does mean spending thousands of pounds to do that, to be able to regulate themselves in such a way that they no longer have the nervous system response that they were born with. So it's almost like going back to our embryonic stage and being able to repattern our cellular memory so that we operate differently, we see the world differently, and therefore we create a sense of safety within us. This is such a gift to children coming into this world. I mean, the American Indian traditions talk about the fact that they consider 7 generations forward in terms of the decisions they make, so the impact of those generations. If we are post-World War II, we are from the First World War, either 5th generation or 3rd generation post-First World War, depending on how quickly our families have created the next generation. But this is like massive. The impact's still massive for us. And at this stage, we have got a bit of a fertility crisis going on because both the way we're living our lives, our lifestyle choices, and also the inherited trauma we have is leading us to a place where until we deal with what is there, it is going to become harder and harder to have babies. Now, people may feel, spend thousands dealing with my trauma first, or go straight for IVF and potentially spend thousands there. Well, the issue that I have with people not dealing with their emotional and mental profile. Thank you, Martin. Sorry, I lost my train. An absolutely vital thing to do before going for IVF is to look at your emotional mental profile and to create safety within. Because if you look at the statistics for IVF, they're not looking too good post 30 something, which is why age has become this huge concern. Because if you are just doing the biomechanics of bringing sperm and egg together and fusing them and then bringing them back into the womb and hoping that they will somehow miraculously survive all of this, we haven't dealt with the health of the sperm, the health of the egg, really. I mean, they'll take every egg, every sperm, clean it up as best as possible, try and make it work, and then you're putting it back into a womb that potentially the womb toxicity, so the stress levels, the anxiety, the fear, the unprocessed trauma is there, which means a woman is going to spend not just her early pregnancy, but her mid-pregnancy and her late pregnancy being terrified of anything happening to this baby because she's longed for it so long. And so the baby is growing in a state of high stress and fear. And this will be the case for anyone who's also had a miscarriage or a stillborn birth and then has gone on to carry a baby again, is if you have not cleared the trauma from the previous miscarriage, termination or stillborn, then you are holding that energy around the baby that is growing. And it can just be in your subconscious because you're paying no attention to it. But signs of the fact that there is unprocessed trauma within you will be that you have digestive issues, you have trouble relaxing, you have addictions, you have trouble sleeping, maybe you do suffer from anxiety, from depression, from panic attacks, maybe you have food issues in terms of eating disorders, or you are overweight or underweight. You know, all of these issues here, medical conditions, gynecological issues we talked about, smoking, drinking. Can you see how it relates back now to the fact that this is why it's so important? So that's why I run my Conceive with Ease program. So let's just think a little bit here about what you can do to conceive with ease and how you can set your ancestors free. Well, I talked in the previous video about this, that the teaser, that this is, in all of this, if we can understand that we're learning more about science all of the time. We're learning more about how we exist more of the time. We're accepting we have an electromagnetic field that is part of our being. So we have our physical body, and then we have our electromagnetic field, which extends beyond our physical body. And so the Heart Math Institute has done some wonderful work around this. But the main thing is how we are in our physical body has an effect on our environment because of the way that our energy extends out. So you know what it's like when you feel attracted to someone and when you feel repelled by someone. You know what it's like when it feels like someone is an energy vampire and essentially they drain you. Just being around them drains you, or when you feel they're vexatious to your spirit. And God forbid, you may be one of those people yourself that people tend to find difficult to be around because there's obsessant talking, or there's obsessant focus on the negative, or worry, or anxiety, or what could go wrong. That's draining to be around. And if that is you, don't worry, because it's not your fault. You know, this is how you learnt to be because of the people around you. And again, it's not their fault because they learnt to be that through the experiences they had. Post-traumatic stress. But it also affects our environment. We emit a frequency outward, and also we emit a frequency into the earth. So it is our duty, in my opinion, to be able to clear up as much of this toxicity that we have inherited and to create safety within. So in so doing, how we set our ancestors free is when we take ownership of something that is within us without guilt, blame or shame, without actually sending out to another person, another being, an attack, really, because of how uncomfortable it is for us to feel what we feel. Then we start to set them free, because guilt really is self-judgment, right? We're going to beat ourselves up so that we don't get punished externally. Blame is when instead of imploding on yourself, you push it out against someone else and you make it about them, and you say, you're the reason that I'm unhappy, you're the reason that I have these problems. So we're judging externally. And shame is kind of a combination of the both, isn't it? It's like, I'm ashamed of how I show up for myself. I'm ashamed of how I show up with others. And this is where I bring in forgiveness and how important forgiveness is. I know people who have really struggled to get pregnant that just will not forgive their mother because their mother wasn't there for them, or won't forgive their father because their father wasn't there for them. Whether that was physical abuse, whether it was alcoholism, whether it was overworking. If you're not going to forgive, then this is going to cause problems for you, because you are the one that is punishing yourself more than anyone else. When you create a softening within your being, you don't just affect the future generations, you affect the generations before. And this is why, So this is why when I look at how I support people, it is a 3-step process essentially. It's around what our attitude is, like how we're showing up towards what we want. We have an intention to conceive. How aligned are we with that intention? So what's in conflict with that intention, both in our external environment and our internal environment? And then what actions do we need to take to be able to overcome that? And that usually works with doing some subconscious work. It means being able to shift our perception and how we show up in difficult situations. And that's what I do with my coaching work. So I'm very blessed to have trained as an emotional mental detox coach with my lovely teacher, Susanna Kennedy, and also to have learnt a lot about bullshit detection through my business coach, Brenda Gabriel, and to have learnt an infinite amount through the wonderful Dr. Francoise Friedman and also Bo Forbes regarding our physiology and what we call the ghosts in the nursery. So how our experience of being nurtured both in utero and in early life affects our ability to either conceive or to be effective parents that show up in such a way that we are present for our children because we're able to be present for ourselves. And this is it, really. This is the deeper work, because it does concern me when people will go and get pregnant at whatever cost, whatever cost, and not do this deeper clearing work, because you might conceive, you might stay pregnant to term, you might go through a birth that's quite pleasant, or it might be medicalised, you might get to the other side where you have a babe in arms. That doesn't mean you have a babe in arms that is happy and content, or that you are happy and content. And parenting is stressful at the best of times. There are so many factors that we have to take into account as we negotiate the world out there and the needs of our children and institutions and our work life and everything that's around us, that if we are living a life where we are perpetually sweeping things under the carpet and not dealing with them and thinking they're not important because we haven't had to think about them thus far, then we tend to pass on to the next generation what we haven't been able to process. And as a very sensitive soul myself, having spent all of my adult life seeking to overcome the early influences that were challenging for me and to move into a place of inner peace and safety, and then to share that and teach that to others and show them the way, I can say that it's not pleasant when you see your unprocessed emotions being played out by your children. And it's very easy for us as parents to blame ourselves, but the thing is, we are the product of our conditioning too. And as I said to you, understanding something with your head and being able to show up differently because you've done the inner work are two very different things. And, I'm a constant work in progress myself. I've done a lot of work around reconditioning my subconscious, but ultimately the after effects are very difficult when your child's already in the world. You have to work with what you've got, and there comes a point that they need to take on the work themselves. This is why I implore everybody to do this deeper work. If you are seeking to have more babies, then the Conceive with Ease course. So if you've never had a baby or you are wanting to have more babies, the Conceive with Ease course is brilliant for clearing all the stuff I've talked about and setting you up, not just for the next child to be in an optimal environment to grow in for you, which is a safe environment, a place of feeling loved and safe and all of our needs being met and that we have the resources to meet them, but it also affects the children you've already had, especially if they're under the age of 7. If you are not looking to have any more children, then my Fearless, Empowered and Free to Be Me program allows you to clear yourself of the conditioning and the erroneous beliefs that you have inherited. So, I could bang on here about stopping smoking, changing your dietary habits, getting rid of endocrine disruptive chemicals. There's all sorts of physical things you can actually do that are very important, and on their own sometimes they can be enough, but usually if someone is having a tough time conceiving or staying pregnant, then this is much more to do with the deep and inner work. So if you are interested in finding out more about that, because it's something that has to be done as a process, then I will put my register your interest link in this video, so it will be in the comments section of this video, and you can get in touch to arrange a breakthrough call. Now, the breakthrough calls are £100. I'm not sure what that is in dollars, but these in themselves are calls that will, in the hour we spend together, be able to get really clear on troubleshooting where your blocks are. So in that sense, they are a breakthrough. And if you already know where your blocks are, it's being able to go deeper with it and to see what you can do to uncover that block. And so in themselves, they can be enough to clear something that is traumatic and to have positive results. But what I usually find is that it's a great opportunity for you to see more of how everything in your life that doesn't feel like it's working relates to your inner world and your inner experience, and then what you can do about it. So in the call itself, you'll have a breakthrough and get tremendous insight and support in terms of the niche experience I have as an expert, both fertility, pregnancy, birth, babies, trauma, right? But also if you decide that you want to continue with me and either do some group coaching or some one-to-one coaching, then the cost of the call will go towards the coaching. So it'll be taken off the overall cost of the course. So I hope that this is interesting for you, and I'd really love to make more videos around this. There are so many different things I could pick out and make shorter videos on. So if you found this interesting, then please do write me a comment and let me know what you'd like to know more about. But just remember that our ancestors are the product of their ancestry and no one is to blame. We're just at a point now where the way I describe it is you're in a room, okay? That room is a complete mess, or maybe it's a bit of a mess. But you want to remake this room, you want to refurbish it. This is your womb room, right? And you can spend your life going, who put this there and who put that there, and I didn't put that there, and I don't like that, and I don't know what that's doing there. And that's all you do. or you can just accept that whatever is there that you don't want to be there needs to be removed so that you can then put in there what you want. And that is the process that I take you through. And this is why judgment, guilt, blame, shame and guilt need to be loved up, and that is the process. I follow a path of grace and ease. This is not about beating yourself up. This is not about austerity. That never got me anywhere other than more triggered into bulimia, and I'm not doing that. I don't do that with people. So this is about being gentle with yourself and seeing where you're not showing up for yourself and where you can show up for yourself in a different way. Essentially, you're learning to reparent yourself. So you become your own inner mother and inner father, and you grow your inner child and the inner masculine and feminine within you that are probably quite wounded to a state where you feel safe in your life to be able to bring a baby into this world. Yes, this world, even though wars still exist, even though threats of economic collapse exist, when you tap into something inside of you that knows no matter what, you'll always be okay, and you can tap into that flow, you can tap into the fact that you're a magnet, yeah, and you're radiating a frequency. And so if for you it's always true that you will always prosper and you will always thrive, then you move out of the struggle paradigm. And it is a choice to choose that you will always be in the right place at the right time, that everything always happens in accordance with divine timing, and that